All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Jared just started the meeting or the official recording of the meeting. So, first of all, welcome to the June meeting of ECO. It is 3 o'clock on the dot. We waste no time here. People are punctual and we're ready to start. So, first of all, happy summer. Doesn't seem like it, but summer literally just started officially just a few days ago, maybe what 4 days ago or so. I hope everybody's staying reasonably cool in this weather because this has been a serious heat wave. Um, And I don't know how much y'all been paying attention, but a lot of the country has really had some record-breaking temperatures for the first time over the past week. So something we'll probably see more and more of, right? That's why we're here. Part of the reason why we're here, I should say. Hey, Amy, fellow co-chair. So without further ado, I say we'll go ahead and get started with the meeting. Jerry put the agenda in the chat. Um, we're going to start off with actually having a presentation from a couple of colleagues with earthday.org. And before they start, I guess, Jerry, you probably have the presentation, right, to share. Or maybe they do.
They have the presentation and they
Okay.
are going to share.
Gotcha. All right, so just really quick, I'll give you a little bit brief bio on the two presenters. Mr. Bryce Kuhn, he's Director of Education at earthday.org. His focus has been on advocating for the inclusion and implementation of climate change education, both internationally and domestically. Bryce has participated and hosted panel discussions with high-level multilateral organizations at both the United Nations Climate and Biodiversity COPs. He has been published in news outlets such as Education Week and the Japanese Journal of Environmental Education. He was previously an educator for Montgomery County Public Schools for over a decade. Mr. Dennis Nolasco, education coordinator at earthday.org. His focus has been on advocating for the inclusion of climate change education into the curricula domestically and in Latin America. Dennis has worked with coalitions to help lead efforts in states such as New York and Oregon to advance climate education. He was previously an educator for both Fairfax County Public Schools and Los Angeles Unified School District. So as you can see, both the gentlemen have some great experience that they're bringing along with them. And of course, it relates to a big hallmark of what we're doing here at ECO, and that is basically climate education. So without further ado, if you all, the gentlemen, you're ready, Bryce and Dennis, and of course, after the presentation, we'll have some time for question and answers. And of course, we'd love for them to stay because again, what they're presenting on will relate to further discussions that we're having in today's meeting. So this time I'll go ahead and turn it over to them.
All right. Thank you so much, Jabari. And it was great meeting you at the program at Bowie State University and seeing your leadership there. So thank you everyone for inviting us here. And as Jabari said, our work is centered around climate education in schools. And we have a presentation that we would like to share with you. So let's see, I'm usually a Zoom guy, so let me find my... Here, I will pull this up. Sorry, give me one moment. Let's do entire screen, and then let's... All right. Can someone confirm that you guys can see this?
You can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, sorry for that delay. It's been a while since I shared my screen on shared my screen on Teams. Okay, so we're looking at embedding climate change education in Maryland. And as Bryce said, my name is Bryce Kuhn, Director of Education with earthday.org, the nonprofit created after the first Earth Day in 1970, which has really always had a focus on education. The first Earth Day had teach-ins across the country and around environmental action. And so now we've been focused on climate education and increasing access to it in schools. And I'll hand it over to my colleague, Dennis, to introduce himself.
Hello, my name is Dennis Nolasco. I'm an education coordinator with earthday.org. Again, thank you, Jabari, for inviting us and everybody here in this work group. I'm very honored to present for you all. As Bryce was saying, here at earthday.org, our focus on the education team is implementing climate education in a comprehensive and interdisciplinary manner. And I know that Maryland already has a lot of great things going for it, but we believe that Maryland can become the forefront of climate education, not just in the United States, but in the world. And so we have a couple of kind of slides that we'll present and kind of a few next steps that will really help Maryland be at the vanguard of this effort.
And so, as Dennis was mentioning earlier, we advocate for an interdisciplinary approach, which we're seeing in some states across the country, which we'll talk about specific case studies later. But, when we think about the climate crisis, it's not something that is just affecting us in the sciences. And the truth is that in the United States, if young people are receiving climate education, it's typically about 2 hours a year, and it's almost exclusively in the sciences. And so, we think that's an issue for a couple of reasons. One, 2 hours a year, I mean, you could get sick and miss 2 days and miss the entire climate crisis, right? That's not acceptable. And then also, by having it just in the sciences, it creates this idea that, first of all, maybe it's the science people's problem, to come up with solutions and to think about this. I was a social studies person myself, so I would, be like, well, I don't really need to think about that. But of course I do, because the climate crisis is impacting all aspects of our lives. So we believe that this needs to be a cross-curricular approach. And, when I taught psychology and economics in Montgomery County, these are things that my students were asking me and that I was able to work into the curriculum and talk about it with that economic lens or the psychological lens. And those connections are throughout the curriculum. We're not saying that teachers in all subject areas should talk about the climate crisis every single day, but there's certainly ways to make connections to that. And we also believe that it should be within the standards. So, we'll talk a little bit about the ways that states have implemented climate education, and you have your standards as a tool to get into the schools. Some states have gone with just a professional development approach, which would be, providing funding or opportunities for teachers to become leaders in climate education. We believe that the standards is so important, even though it is a little bit more of a difficult task, because it becomes protected as part of the process. So it's harder to get them in, but it's also harder to get them out. And that's something that the community has been saying for years. And sadly, we just saw that Washington State had their professional development funds dry up. So what does that mean for the future of climate education in Washington? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that if it was in the standards, it would be less impacted than it's going to be now.
Yeah, and I just want to add an anecdotal story here from my own perspective. So when I was an educator in LA, we had the wildfires happening in Northern California. The smoke came down to Los Angeles, and my students had all these questions about it. At the time, my school did not have a full-time science teacher, so I kind of took it upon myself to rework one of my units to be all about climate change. So we read articles, current events about the situation that's happening in Northern California. We wrote essays. It was really great. We read a book called 2 Degrees by Alan Gratz that focuses on climate change. And it all culminated with a beach cleanup in LA County. So again, it was a great experience. But as Bryce was saying, this was not something that was in the standards. This was just something that was a kind of personal interest of mine. And so my colleague, who was the other 8th grade English teacher, she did not teach about this. And so, my 120 students were able to receive a month of climate education, but the ones that were in my colleague's class, they just heard about it through the grapevine. And so again, by having it in the standards, and both Bryce and I as former educators, we know that the standards is kind of our playbook. That's where we map out our curriculum for the year. And so by making sure that climate education is in the standards, you make sure that every single teacher touches on it in some shape or form.
And I think if you look at the age-appropriate content, we can think about why states like New Jersey that has cross-curricular climate education from K through 12, although K through 2, they're not going to call it climate, they're not going to be using climate crisis in there. But it's to have this age-appropriate science-based information in schools. Sometimes I make the analogy, which at first mention seems a little odd maybe, but I think about, why do we have sex education? People are talking about sex with friends, or their parents should be talking about sex with their children. You see it on TV shows and movies. It's everywhere. But that's the reason why we have these courses, because it's so important that we have age-appropriate information that is based in facts and presented with students at a time in which they can process that information and ask questions. So the fact that the climate crisis is talked about so much is not a reason not to have it in schools. It's so much more of a reason why we need to have it, because, if you spend a lot of time on social media, or people who do, like, that can be a pretty scary place. And the images and the content that people are getting around the climate crisis it could be very disturbing. And it's something that students need to process. It's a major crisis that young people are feeling very anxious about. And we don't really have a space for that. You have 2 hours a year in your science class to process the climate crisis. What if your science teacher, what if you don't have a good relationship with your science teacher, or, what if you miss those days? And so that's one of the reasons why we believe it's so important that it's across disciplines and age appropriate and fact based.
Bryce mentioned earlier that there are a few states that have implemented climate education in some shape or form. And so here are just some examples, and they're all pretty recent. So you can see here, Maine has launched a pilot program that will provide professional development for educators. New Jersey, they kind of went more of a standards route. And so New Jersey has climate education in all subject areas and all grade levels. And they also have established an office of climate education. There are other examples there with Washington as well, although, like Bryce said, the funding has dried up there in Washington because it was not protected. If it had been in the standards, though, it would be harder to take out. Actually, as Bryce was talking, I just got an email about Oregon. The governor of Oregon actually just minutes ago signed this climate education bill, House Bill 3365, into law. And so now climate education is not just taught in science classes in Oregon, but is taught in English and history in an interdisciplinary manner. So, already there's movement happening right now. And, we have Maryland there positioned to be one of the leaders in climate education. And is already doing some great work, but we think there's more that can be done. So if you go to the next slide, Bryce.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, as working on this all the time for the past couple of years and thinking about it in the States, as a very proud Marylander and someone who spent 11 years teaching Maryland students, I believe this is so important. And so that's one of the reasons why, we've been finding every opportunity to talk about this. And, that's why we're here today, to talk about the need for climate education. And, like many states, we all have our different vulnerabilities around the climate crisis. We have the Chesapeake Bay, which, has threatened the coastal communities. It's such an important part of our, culture in those communities. Increases in flooding. Some of our, cities have seen some very devastating flooding in the past years that, has been very upsetting and very difficult for those cities. Agriculture, public health, the biodiversity that we have in the state. And so this requires an urgent response. And I've alluded to this point before, but the mental health aspect and eco-anxiety is so important. When I was in the classroom, it's something that students are thinking about a lot. And we need to be talking about it more in our schools. And, sometimes, when you're as a teacher, we ask our teachers to do a lot, and teachers might view this as kind of one more thing they need to do. And I try and, tell teachers, first off, there's ways to embed it into your teaching already. So if you're teaching, an economics lesson on negative externalities of production, that can have a climate lens to it, and it's not really going to take that much more time. But the other aspect is, even if it is something extra, it is so important. We need to deal with this. We need to face it head on with our students because of their mental health and eco-anxiety. So if you talk to young people about the climate crisis, I think you would probably have the same experience that I've had, which is that they either are very anxious and frustrated and feel like leadership in the country is not doing enough, or they kind of shut down and have like a sense of like nihilism, because that's one way that they've, you know, learned to process this. And both of those are really coming from, those are both manifestations of their anxiety. And there is data to say that talking about these aspects more and having it in schools does not increase anxiety like you might think it would. It decreases it, because you're talking about it, again, in an age-appropriate, fact-based way with a teacher who can process this information instead of just seeing random, you know, Instagram reels or things on TikTok.
As Bryce was saying, I mean, this is a topic that is highly supported. You know, national polls here show that 76% of parents support climate change being taught in schools. And even more so in Maryland. This is all based off Yale Climate Map study from a few years ago. 84% of Marylanders believe that climate change should be taught in schools. So the public support is there for wanting to teach us. And as Bryce was saying, you want your kids, your students, to be learning about this from a trusted adult, as opposed to learning about it through social media, through, you know, a 30-second clip that is meant to get an emotional reaction. You want fact-based, you want age-appropriate discussion on climate change. And the best way to do this is for it to be talked about in schools with trusted adults. You know, currently Maryland is doing some work on that front. There is an environmental literacy specialist at the Maryland Department of Education. I've been in contact with them. You know, there are a few standards. So Maryland has adopted the Next Generation Science Standards, which does talk about climate change. But as Bryce mentioned, you know, on average, climate change is only discussed for 2 hours per school year. So if you are absent that day, then you miss the climate crisis. You know, ELA, art, math are largely left out in terms of talking about climate change. Currently, there is an environmental literacy graduation for all Maryland students attending public school in Maryland. And I saw that Delegate Stein was here today, and Delegate Stein has been a great champion for climate education. You know, there was a Climate Education Week bill that was that passed almost unanimously in the House, but unfortunately did not progress after that. But there is movement, there is momentum in the state, and we really do think that Maryland could be at the vanguard of this movement.
So as you know, we've been talking about, Maryland has the opportunity to lead here. We have, you know, like every state, you know, we have our own unique ways that we're being impacted by the climate crisis. And we believe that embedding climate education into the disciplines will support this, our environmental objectives and our sustainability and resilience targets. So there is work that's being done in some local case studies. You know, Prince George's County has climate education in some of their courses, and Montgomery County also has a comprehensive environmental strategy. But again, these things are not in the curriculum, and they're not, you know, going through the legislative process in the way that they have in New Jersey and now Oregon and Illinois and Maine. And so, you know, what we're seeing is, you know, this kind of like patchwork, and we're also seeing work that's not necessarily protected. And, you know, when I think about this, again, I just think I see those other states leading, and I feel like Maryland should be one of them. So we believe that, you know, we know this is a lengthy process. We've, you know, of having climate literacy standards, of going through the standards process. We know this is something that doesn't happen overnight. It's a big ask. I do think that one of the things, the advantages that Maryland has at this point is, as much as it would have been great to be the first state to implement cross-curricular climate education K through 12, we're not. New Jersey was. and we have learned so much from the work that New Jersey has done over the past few years. Dennis and I ourselves, we have a really close relationship with the Office of Climate Education in New Jersey. There's a Coalition for Climate Education Policy that we are active members of, and we recently hosted a webinar in which we brought together these members from the state climate education offices and other people who have been leading it in states. So it's kind of an opportunity where Maryland can still be a leader in climate education, and we have the advantage that some of the early kinks have been worked out. And I believe that, you know, like Oregon, for example, is going to have a much better experience incorporating climate education than New Jersey did, because New Jersey hit road bumps, and now the community is strong and everyone knows what those road bumps are and can work through them together. Professional development is certainly a part of this. There's two reasons why the top two reasons why teachers are not teaching climate education is, one, they don't believe they have enough of an understanding of the topic. And secondly, they believe it doesn't connect to their content area. And so I don't think it's even, you know, that much training to break down those walls and to have the conversation with teachers that you don't need to know everything about the climate crisis. You don't need to, you know, understand all the science behind it. But, you know, if you're an English teacher, you know, you can make one of your assignments about, you know, journalism around the climate crisis. How is it being reported on? Or if you're an economics teacher, you can do an assignment about externalities, or psychology, you know, how is it impacting mental health? So, you know, we believe that if we could encourage interagency collaboration on this, you know, Maryland State Department of Education, we have the Climate Commission, higher education, there's local community organizations, there's national NGOs, and there's a network of people who support climate education. And like I said, have done it in states. And so there's a roadmap and sample bills and standards that we can look at. So if there's, you know, an opportunity for recommendation to the, you know, Commission on Climate Change for climate education across Maryland schools, that would obviously be very supportive. You know, we're just thrilled that Delegate Stein is here with us today to listen to this, and would love to hear the delegate's thoughts on it and how this could be supported in Maryland. There is, as I mentioned, there's the Coalition for Climate Education Policy. There is a very strong network of organizations. So there's us at Earth Day, but National Wildlife Federation, the North American Association for Environmental Education. There are so many groups and universities and schools who are coming together. So we believe that this is also going to transcend partisan divides. Obviously, when you talk about climate change, that's not, you know, necessarily the truth, but how we talk about it, right? And one of the key components also is jobs, the green economy, which is growing so quickly. And yet there's not a complete understanding of what those jobs are and the opportunities for our young people. We obviously want the state of Maryland to be an economic leader in the green economy. So we thank you so much for your time today and inviting us to come speak with you. And we'd love to answer any questions you have about climate education.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both. Jared, you have a question already?
That was the
Before.
clap, but it looks like
Oh, it's a
Delegate Stein
clap. Gotcha. Okay. No, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much for that. And I'm sure we probably have a few questions or maybe even comments from some of our ECO members. Any questions or
I
comments?
think Delegate Stein has a.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Sorry, I missed that. You're still on mute.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks for that presentation. Excellent. And I certainly support the goal of integrating, age-appropriate climate education learning standards into the Maryland curriculum. I really am surprised to hear that there's only maybe 2 hours is that like one learning unit or something per, in particular classes, I guess what at high school maybe, but it's whatever it is. I mean, it's shockingly little, especially since we do have an environmental literacy requirement. so I certainly do support the idea of getting the State Board of Education to adopt learning standards for all schools. What one question is there, like if we went to MSDE and said, we really think the State Board of Education should consider this, and they said, okay, do you have a model set of standards that we could take a look at? I know you said New Jersey has adopted this, other states are considering it. So I guess my question is, would there be sort of a document that you think would be a good template? Is that always makes things easier? In presenting this?
Yeah, and thank you, Delegate Stein, for those thoughts. I will say, it's possible that Maryland, the 2 hours per year was a national average. I will say that, and it's possible that through the environmental work, and I see Laura on this call. So I think that we might be a little bit above that. That might include some states that are doing 0, right? And so it's kind of bringing the average down. But we still believe that there's a lot of opportunity for more. And yeah, I do think we haven't gotten to the point of creating a document that brings together those standards, but they're out there and they've been reviewed. So I think that if Maryland takes us on, they're going to have an easier path than some of the early states.
Okay, just a follow-up, if I might. So let's say maybe this fall, we try to start the discussion either with the commission or with MSDE, which I'm certainly happy to do. You think it might be possible to say to them, yeah, we can, there's some models out there that we could refer to that, let's say the State Board of Education agrees that these should be developed, that then their learning, their specialists, curricular specialists could refer to adopt a curriculum. And certainly, as you say, there are items that are unique to Maryland that we would want to incorporate.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, as a starting point, like MSD has tons of experts. They have environmental literacy experts. So I think that especially the language from, like the Oregon bill, which would be very, very strong. And there's also like an opportunity to think about, like New Jersey was every single subject, including physical education, right? And you can see how you could do that, right? If you had a day that was, there are days that we can't let our students go outside because of excessive heat, or, we've had, wildfire smoke come down, right? You just tell those teachers, when you have those days, have those conversations. Or you say, notice how the black track is warmer than the grassy area in the field, and think about how that heat affects the body during exercise. So there's certainly opportunities in every subject. It's a little bit harder in some subjects. Economics, I would have been able to tie it in, 50 times. The Oregon bill is in all of the core subjects. So we still see that as a victory. But that was one of the changes that was made to the bill.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. So Tristan next, then Laura, then Jennifer.
All right. Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I got stuck in a little bit of traffic, so I'm en route. So I really appreciated the slide that you guys had where it was like, these are our 3 key, asks or like suggestions for Maryland to move forward on this. And it was just nice to have it so succinctly laid out, because as I'm listening, I'm like, okay, but like, where do we go? How does this apply? Blah, blah. I know that our ECO working group in the past has had a recommendation on, mandatory climate literacy education. And my memory is that I recall, like, it was just flat out nixed, like didn't even make it past, all the way onto the commission. It felt like the word on the street was like, it's a no-go. Teachers are already so burdened. It's an unfunded, mandate or expectation. And so we've been trying to think about like more creative ways to get it integrated. I'm wondering if any of these other states that you've worked with had similar, hesitations at first that maybe they worked through that we could use as fodder for our own challenges.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is, that's, as I was saying, it is asking teachers to do something that they're not doing now for many teachers. It might not necessarily be more work, but it's changing the work that they're already doing and making, you don't need additional days, but you maybe that training. And yeah, New Jersey did have funding around this. So they had funding for teacher training. Dennis, I'm not sure if there's any other states that you could speak to.
I mean, the only thing I was going to add to that is that there is a wealth of resources out there. And I'm just going to plug in that, for example, Subject to Climate, which is another nonprofit that focuses on combining all these resources in a nice kind of easy to use place on the internet where teachers can go find them. So there's tons of resources out there. But as Bryce was saying, these resources aren't effective if there's no training, no professional development that goes along with it. But there's a will out there where teachers are seeking out these resources. It's something that they're asking for, especially in and around Earth Day, and also now it's Earth Month. I mean, we see that that spike around that time, but it shouldn't just be in April when we talk about this. It should be all year long.
Okay, thank you guys. I appreciate that. I definitely know there are those, above and beyond rock star teachers who are so passionate about teaching for the climate that they're using such subject for climate. They're seeking out the professional development. I feel like having the required curriculum or the required, literacy elements is reaching those teachers that aren't seeking it out and making it mandatory, so that we know that all students are getting that education. And that to me feels like such a big barrier. Maybe it's the funding piece that we really need to figure out.
Yeah, and I think
it's gonna work out.
and I think that when you're reworking and you're trying to incorporate something that is important to you, your state or your district, like you do a review of your standards, and not to say that there's things in the standards that aren't important, but there's things that are more important, and you do have to make decisions. When I was teaching government, we made decisions to include, Montgomery County made decisions to include aspects of segregation in Montgomery County and a history of that and the legal processes around it. That was very meaningful curriculum to have. And it's also something that the students were very engaged with. It's something that they wanted to learn about. They felt connected to that. And so if I have to, go in a little less detail on the, compromise of 1876, or I don't even know, if it was 1876, but there's all these like tiny little like government history things that are like show up on a standardized test that, students learn. And then, I taught it for 10 years and I'm not even sure I got the year right. Like those things, there's a lot of those things in there. So you do a review of it and you make those decisions about what's important. And I just think that this is on our students' minds. And I think we're doing, a little bit of a disservice by not having, more conversations around it.
And I just want to add as well that the way that the Oregon bill is written is that they have these standards review processes on an annual basis. And so what the bill says is that during the next annual review process, they will implement climate education into the standards for all core curriculum. And so it doesn't require extra funds because it's already something they're doing. They're already doing the standards review process on an annual basis and then creating resources. So it's not additional work for the Department of Education. So yeah, definitely I can provide for the working group also the language of the Oregon bill, which talks about that.
Thank you for that. And I know Amy's hand is up for third, because we actually, part of the discussion that we're going to talk about is the recommendations, and we'll talk about that as well. So we'll be more focused on that a little bit later in the discussion. But Laura, I think you had a comment, then Jennifer as well.
Yep. Hey, hi, Bryce and Dennis. It's nice to see you and to hear your presentation. there is, I mean, Maryland is such an interesting case because we have our environmental literacy standards. They're unfunded and untested. In 2020, they went through a review. I understand that COMAR has to go through, COMAR legislation has to go through a review about every 5 years. And that was when they actually took some of the climate change out of the environmental literacy standards because it was in GSS and they didn't want to have it there redundant. Yesterday, I attended with Kristen and about 100 others the Mid-Atlantic Climate Change Education Conference. And there were formal educators there, non-formal educators, organizations interested. There are, like we find with our Green Schools program, there are loads of teachers that are interested, but it's not something that is across the board. I think it would be interesting to have the discussion about environmental literacy and climate change. We have those conversations in the Chesapeake Bay Program Education Work Group all the time, as well as in the Outdoor Learning Partnership, which is a partnership between MSDE and DNR with partners throughout the state that are working in environmental education. Because of the frustrations that we have with the environmental literacy requirement, and the fact that it is unfunded and that teacher professional development is something that we do get funds for. And now we have a tighter budget. There's less funds for organizations to get. I think we really have to be creative in terms of how we bring them together or something like that. Because it's like if we have such a strong community in environmental education and 693 schools that are participating in the Maryland Green Schools program, you know, there's a lot of interest that's there, but we have the same problem with environmental literacy standards of teachers who are engaged and then those who won't leave the classroom or they, you know, can't find the time, or like you said in one of your comments, Bryce, you know, it's not about like, it's like changing how you teach, but it's not like completely leaving what you're familiar with. Yeah. So those are just all comments because I don't want us to forget that we are still working hard to get environmental literacy and having, you know, those numbers increased. And Maryland in the Mid-Atlantic is one of the strongest, even probably stronger than New Jersey, even though they've got the standards. But I'm happy to participate. You know, I work with you all on the Coalition for Climate Change Education and a couple of other places too. But it would be interesting, Delegate Stein, to kind of see what we have and then, you know, what could we do to strengthen it, really. I think, you know, and I don't think it's a one or the other. I really do think it's like a joining forces because we have such a big force in environmental education in our state.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. Appreciate that. And of course, we'll begin to Delegate Stein next. But Jennifer, I know you have some comments.
So last session, there was a bill around hate crimes and using education to help educate around that, around anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. And there was tremendous pushback from people saying that schools like to be locally controlled and they don't like state telling them what to do, what to teach. And there was tremendous resistance by the key committee chair and also around the fiscal note. So whatever we do, I just want to caution that that we try and make it a fiscal note that is tiny and that we try and make it something that people can choose to do and are not forced to do, or I don't think it would realistically get passed. I mean, I'm just wondering, given the plethora of outstanding resources that are out there for educators on climate, if just asking the Department of Education to put a series of them on their website and then to invite people to online training seminars, even if they're done by outside nonprofits, even that would be better than nothing. I'm just concerned about the pushback. And I was very interested in what Delegate Stein said about the financial education, that when those were brought in, that there was a financial institution, I don't know if it's a banker who actually paid for the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Delegate Stein, you want to go ahead and chime in? You're still on mute. Delegate Stein, you're still on mute.
I'll be brief. I mean, and Jennifer is completely right. I mean, when the legislation concerning curriculum on hate crimes was introduced, there was pushback. What it did lead to was an agreement by MSDE to review social study curriculum to incorporate more, I don't know if it's learning standards, more information about hate crimes, Holocaust education, and related topics. And that's in the process of being, I think, approved by the State Board of Education. And just, I've been involved with financial education for a long time. I'm co-chair of the state's Commission on Improving Financial Education. And back 12 years ago, we faced this same issue. Do we pass legislation mandating a curriculum? And instead, what we did is we went to the State Board of Education, which, we'd consulted with in advance, and they were amenable to adopting learning standards. And that's the reason why I said, is there a template? Because at the time there were two learning standards templates, Wisconsin and somewhere else, which then MSDE adapted and then was approved. So I think Jennifer's right. I mean, recommending legislation requiring MSDE or the State Board of Education to adopt a curriculum would be tough. However, working maybe behind the scenes with the State Board of Education, at least at the outset, see if they'd be amenable. Maybe they wouldn't be, but it's worth a try.
Yeah, I would just to add to that. Yeah, I mean, I understand we saw the concern, like Jennifer was talking about with Oregon. Oregon is, it's a liberal state, right? But we know that there's a lot of, I guess it's kind of similar to Maryland in some ways, geopolitically. So, yeah, I think that is a concern. Obviously, they did it, right? Like Oregon managed to do it. So, it can happen, and I'm sure that those local feelings are the same there. We have had conversations with MSDE around this. We've just had one, but as an organization, we don't have a lot of contacts there. And if the commission or commission members or somehow or so like Delegate Stein, your side might carry a little bit more weight, and as an organization, either by ourselves or with the Coalition for Climate Education Policy, we would be happy to kind of organize all the material we can that could be shared with MSDE. Like we could do the legwork for that. Thank you.
You're on mute, Jabari.
I just noticed that too. Thanks. So this has been some great discussion thus far. I said, let's keep the conversation going. And by the way, Amy, was there anything you wanted to add before we proceed?
Well, I have two things. One, sad, I checked the attendance today, and it looks like neither of our representatives from MSDE are on the call. That would have been nice for this presentation, and possibly it created a connection there. We had experienced this year with the teach-in, I just wanted to point this out, several school districts with great concern about participating in climate education and how that could possibly impact federal funding. So that is something else, a new challenge in pursuing any kind of requirement, I think, that is going to make it a pretty tough sell. These were large school districts, and we're fairly certain that they actually communicated their concerns to each other before coming to us, and it was, yeah, it was a little surprising. So a new challenge on the front of climate
Yeah.
education.
And those school districts made it known, or at least one of the made it known that they were very much in support of the cause. But to Amy's point, they were just concerned about, you know, what kind of repercussions could possibly happen as a result. And I think that kind of more so, well, I don't want to get to the political part, but I think that does speak to the political climate they were in. I mean, I'll let Delegate Stein maybe talk a little bit more about that if he chooses to. But before we get to Delegate Stein, we're coming to you right after his last comment from Laura. So yeah, Laura, go ahead. Or question.
Yeah, so Peyton Hess, who has been the environmental specialist for a year or so, resigned and is going back into the school, Anne Arundel County Public Schools, as Annapolis High School's science department head. And Dana, or Delegate Stein, if I can say anything to you, it is that sometimes MSDE sits on that FTE and doesn't fill it very quickly. But it is an FTE that is there and should be filled. And my hope is that they will start to recruit fairly soon, because we need that person and that role to be filled for the work, climate and environmental education.
Well, honestly, I think this is probably a good time to turn it over to Delegate Stein so that you can kind of just talk about some of the things that you, by the way, Delegate Stein is a champion for the work that we're doing. He's also a member of the commission already. And we worked with him last year. Sometimes it seemed like it's longer than that, but we worked with him last year on trying to pass legislation. And as Bryce, as you mentioned in your presentation, it did, or maybe Dennis, one of you mentioned that it did overwhelmingly pass in the House. So Delegate Stein, we kind of wanted just to get an idea from you on maybe some of the bills that, you know, became priority last year, or some of the things you focused on, and also maybe some possible strategies for trying to move this forward next year.
Sure. No, thanks. And you're right. Back in 2024, I did sponsor legislation which made it out of the House to establish a climate education week. It faltered in the Senate, and so the bill didn't pass. In this past session, I didn't introduce it, reintroduce it, but I'm willing to do it next year. I do think it would be really helpful to have a Senate sponsor, and especially if in the House, the bill went before the House and Government Operations Committee. They deal with among their many other subject areas, they deal with designation of bills that would designate particular education day or a day that's a memorial for something. So it passed HGO. In the Senate, it's EEE, Education, Environment, and Energy Committee. So really think it'd be helpful to have a Senate sponsor, especially from that committee. I do have someone in mind. I was thinking of maybe talking with Senator Brooks about that. But I think that would be a critical piece to try to advancing it. I mean, I know that and for Jabari and other folks who are involved in the effort, gosh, it was just last year, 2024. There was a question about the timing of the week, as initially we had it for the, I guess the first week in April, and the feedback we got from the Senate committee was, well, it might prohibit legislators from participating because we're still in session then. So I think a compromise was, okay, we'll push it until the third week in April. I think that's what we said. So, that's probably, even though that may not be the ideal time to coincide with other sort of environmental efforts, I do think that's a good way to go. So anyway, long story short, I can't say that I've taken the temperature in the Senate, but I'm willing to try again, especially if we can find a Senate sponsor. This year, I don't think, and I went through the 90-day report just to be sure, but I don't I don't recall any other environmental or climate education legislation that, that was introduced. I might have missed something because, again, if it's education or, a particular designation, it wouldn't go through the committee I'm on, which is the Environment and Transportation Committee. But first read, I couldn't see anything on it. I know, question was in wake of, environmental education by Delegate Wallach got left in committee. Okay. All right. So I stand corrected. Let's see, what is my personal perspective as to how the state should be adjusting in the wake of federal changes, particularly as it relates to climate messaging? I mean, I think I don't think that there'll be hesitation among legislators to pursue climate initiatives because of whatever you want to call it, this fever that's gripping the current administration that's so against anything climate related, to the point where, non-environmental grants from the federal government, among other things, can't include, in a number of cases, can include like equity or diversity or climate or renewable energy. So it's bizarre, but hopefully it will pass. Regardless, the legislature is still fully committed on, with respect to climate generally, as well as I think climate education. So, I think no reason for us not to pursue something with respect to, Climate Week. I think I'd be a little bit more hesitant to have legislation that would require climate standards just for the sort of the issues that we talked about with Jennifer, is the fact that there's the legislature, there's general reluctance on the part of the legislature to mandate education curriculum issues, and there is pushback from MSDE and other education groups against the legislature doing that in a number of different areas. But certainly with respect, so I think maybe more, continue the conversation with MSDE to see how amenable they might be on that issue would be, and I'm happy to participate in those discussions, would be maybe for me a first step before considering any legislation on that. So let's see. And love to hear more about the climate teaching, which I guess is after me, but those, that's my 2 cents. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Delegate Stein. Yeah, so as you all know, we have the footprint, and I know you're saying Climate Education Week right now is probably going to be the focus. One thing that I do want to mention, and Jared actually put this in the chat because we did talk about this in one of our planning groups, was possibly not limiting it to a certain week in April. For instance, the climate teach-in, and by the way, I'll let Amy talk about that if she wants to, because I know we've talked about that a lot, but we decided to kind of extend the initial week for Climate Education Week in April to the entire month of April. And that pretty much allowed those teachers to, use the entire, be flexible throughout the entire month. Part of that reason was also because certain school districts take spring break at different times. So that's something that we can probably consider, is not limiting it to a certain week. I don't know if that maybe one thing that could possibly help. I see Jennifer, you also wanted to say something too.
Well, I just love the idea of, education in schools around climate. So I wanted to point out that on the Senate side, we're very fortunate in that education is in the same committee as the environment and energy. So the senators in that committee already are pretty steeped in those issues. In looking at the roster of who's in it, I thought maybe Delegate Stein could ask Dalia Attar, for example, if this might be of interest to her, since she sits on that committee and is local to him. So it was just a thought. But I also wanted to point out that in terms of where I heard the senators and where their focus was last year in session, and what I think it will be again, is the price of energy and their concern around climate stuff costing more from an energy perspective, which is what the energy companies have been pushing. So I'll just give you an example. This week, I got a letter from BGE notifying me that my rates are going to go up very substantially. And they literally put in the letter that that's because of Empower, the Empower bill law, that my rates were going to go up, which David Lapp has a 7-page explainer on his website on as to why that is not the case. But I do think financial education connected to climate is very important, and helping children look at this is how you can make your energy bill lower, your food bill lower, your health, bill lower, all by doing the right things on climate.
That's a very good point, Jennifer. And I think that would kind of tie in, actually. I know I'm just doing a lot of segueing here, but I believe that actually is going to tie into our recommendations from ECO in some way. So Laura, I'll let you make this last comment or question, then I'm going to turn it over to Amy so that we can kind of get to the recommendations portion.
So
Sure.
just a final comment, and that is that I know that a lot of grants in our community are being written now that link environmental education and climate education. And so I think that's a positive thing, that people are seeing climate education requests. Funders are seeing those requests. So anyway, I know there is support for that. And I think we need to keep moving that piece of the agenda forward.
Sure.
With the right people and the right discussions.
Absolutely. And Delegate Stein, if you have time, would you mind, if you can stay for the next part to the recommendations? Okay. I'll turn over to Amy now.
Thanks. These were great discussions, really great discussions. One of the things we have to do as a committee is make recommendations to the overall commission. The process is a little different this year, and we talked about that, I think, at our first meeting, where because the commission has really doubled in size. I mean, it went from 4 working groups to 8, the number, and I guess review, the time taken to review and discuss and really dissect recommendations last year was challenging. Managing that process was difficult, so they've asked us to use a refined process to submit our recommendations this year, and they have asked all the working groups to limit recommendations to around 3. So we had been, the commission requested that we submit kind of like an early thought process on that, which we did, and some of those, we've gone through and kind of started some investigation on them. I think one of them's already fallen to the wayside based on what we've learned. But the other part of that is that commissioners themselves have submitted recommendations to the working groups to be considered as well. And Jennifer has submitted a really robust recommendation on community engagement and partnerships that I think we should probably talk about first, since that's kind of a new one on the table, and any decision we might make on that, we might have to do some additional research. And I'd like to, if there's any next steps we need to take before we consider whether that would be a recommendation, I'd like to work that out. The discussion after that, I think, should focus on Climate Education Week and trying to work out what our plan of action will be about whether we're recommending that, how we're recommending that this year. And then for our third recommendation, we can look at the presentation we sent in earlier this year and to see whether either of the last remaining 2 are still viable. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure one of them is not. So let's start with Jennifer. Jennifer, would you like to introduce your recommendation? And I have the PDF here. I can share it or you can share it. It's completely up to you.
If you can share it, that would be fantastic. But meanwhile, I'd like to just confirm with Jared Williams, if that's okay. If I understand correctly, Jared, we automatically forward any recommendations that we as a committee previously recommended that have not yet been done in law or policy. Is that correct? Because in the past, we did recommend climate education. And so if I'm not mistaken, that will not count towards our 3. That would count as something that we already have. Am I correct in that? Is it 3 brand new ones or 3 including the old ones?
So the first, I'll say that it's 4 recommendations per working group.
Oh, it's 4 now.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
there was some confusion around the numbers, so each can put forward 4. And you're correct, Jennifer, that standing recommendations that haven't been followed through on still stand, and that we're not typically reintroducing those unless there is an adjustment to be made to that recommendation. I know that, for example, the mitigation working group is talking about that now around how to introduce similar topics with some twists so that they're considered new and push forward some new ideas. So you can be creative about it, but you're correct that standing recommendations are still standing.
Great. So Jared, you may want to send around to this task force which are the ones that are relevant that we already have that will be going forward unless this committee decides to change them for some reason, because I don't want to be redundant to what we're already proposing. But the reason for this recommendation is as follows. We're in a very tough fiscal environment, as we all know. Last year, we faced a $3 billion gap that we had to close, and it was quite painful. In closing that gap, we did not approve as a state any new funding mechanisms. Delegate Stein had one really great bill that I was hopeful for. It didn't pass, and neither did any of the others to generate new income to deal with climate programs. And not only that, the CEF was substantially rated to the tune of about $150 million that went to the general budget, and $220 million that went back to ratepayers, including high-income ratepayers. And so as a result, the money that could have been used towards climate in many cases was not, and there was a lack of transparency and trust between the administration and the climate community that was surprised, for example, by vetoes of multiple climate bills that happened at the very last moment. One of the key ways that we can achieve success in the climate realm is by assuming that the government isn't going to be able to solve all the problems that the people, the nonprofit institutions, the companies, the stakeholders are going to have to do more, that we're going to have need a more collaborative environment, and we're going to need shared responsibility, shared accountability, and that the best way to do that is to make sure those stakeholders are part of the conversation in the get-go, and that it is not that they're told what's going to happen at the last minute, but that they're brought in to bring forward great solutions and ideas at the start. And so therefore, I put forward this recommendation, which is not for a bill that would bring new money. It's really for a process of transparency and collaboration. So it says the Maryland Commission on Climate Change urges the Moore-Miller administration to strengthen public trust and accelerate climate change progress by expanding community engagement and cross-sector partnerships. This includes investing in public education efforts, co-creating climate strategies with nonprofits, businesses, and residents, and supporting events like Power in the Park that make climate solutions accessible and inclusive. By fostering transparency, participatory governance, Maryland can mobilize broader action and meet its climate goals more effectively. So underneath that, I just have, more explanation about that. But this is not asking for more money. This is about asking the administration, including the cabinet secretaries and departments, to be more involved in public partnership and bringing other stakeholders into finding solutions and working together. So that is what this proposal suggests.
Okay, does anybody have, and we did send this out, right, Jared? We sent this out to everybody. So, so this is a little different for us. I don't think we've ever considered anything like this or recommended anything like this before. It is the explanation below has a lot of detail in it, but I don't think we have the ability to submit that, or maybe we can submit it as supporting documentation, but it's definitely not part of the recommendation itself.
Correct.
So,
And by the way, I had a lengthy meeting yesterday with SAFE from the governor's office to walk him through a lot of these ideas, and he was very interested in them. You know, I really connected it to a conversation around what Clinton Gore did during their administration around reinventing government, and the new book Abundance by Ezra Klein that really talks about how there seems to be a gap between climate goals and the ability of well-intended policymakers to deliver on those goals, and the need for there to be more collaboration and more focus on results.
yeah. I mean, I don't know, Delegate Stein, what do you, I mean, I'm struggling a little bit with who the recipient, or who would take this and run with it, kind of a thing. I think that's a question that the commission would ask of us. They were very specific, at least the steering committee for the commission was very specific about us, very specifically telling them who was to take action on any recommendation.
Well, Megan Conklin is the staff person responsible for every agency within the state government having a climate plan and implementing said climate plan. Outside of the administration, there is Climate Partners, which is very focused on monitoring and supporting the Climate Solutions Now Act. It's essentially a coalition of 50 different climate and environmental groups. So partnership between those entities alone would be fantastic.
Okay. Yes, Delegate Stein.
Yeah, to follow up on Jennifer's point about the fact that that most state agencies were required to develop a plan on how they will implement key goals under the Climate Solutions Act, Climate Solutions Now Act. You know, perhaps, you know, these are items that in the next iteration of those climate plans, I forget how often they have to be issued, you know, could be included. You know, if we didn't want to task like one particular agency, say MDE, with doing this, and they probably would say they're, you know, they're swamped, they can't take this on by themselves. You know, perhaps other, you know, other key agencies that are tasked with implementing goals under the climate plan.
I would like to see a little bit more specifics in terms of details for the first bullet point. Seems too generalized.
Well, and consider this, we won't be able to include the bullet point in our recommendation. I mean, it will be, we literally have the opportunity to put in a couple sentences.
Yeah, I would just want to refine that down into what the action item is. There doesn't seem to be an action item. That's very clear.
Is there something specifically that you would like to see as an action item along the goals that we've articulated?
I think something that would accomplish some of those goals would be to focus on a PSA program.
So we had that was a prior recommendation.
So that exists. as a recommendation.
That does. It wasn't specific to this. It was specific. It was more general, but it certainly was not a welcome goal previously. Especially unfunded, because PSA campaigns cost a lot of money. Kristen?
So I'm feeling a little, I don't know, concerned that our old recommendations are still going to be considered with our new recommendations. Not because I don't believe in them still, but I'm wondering if maybe we were like, oh wait, this one's a better way of meeting that previous goal. Never mind, we don't want to do that recommendation we had from 4 years ago. Like, do we have an opportunity to nix old ones?
Yeah, Jared?
So in terms of like reintroducing similar concepts, as I said earlier, like we can take recommendations that did exist previously, workshop them, and then present that as a new idea, even if it still is very similar to something previous, as long as we can point to the differences. In terms of taking back previous recommendations, no, we don't have any sort of structure in place for that.
Well, and keep in mind, Tristan, that the old recommendations will not be included in the new report. At least they never have in the past. They're just kind of out there in an old version of the report, which I don't even think is live. I don't think the old version
Okay, yeah, I guess.
Are they?
I guess
They
I'm a
are.
little
They're on the website.
Okay.
Like, is the commission going to be looking at our new recommendation, the one Jennifer's proposed that we're looking at right now, and ones we've had from years prior, and say, which of these 7 do we like?
No.
Okay.
No, only the new recommendations we're allowed, Jared said we can submit 4. That's all the commission's going to look at this year.
Okay.
They are not
I guess-
going to revisit previous recommendations.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, so if previous recommendations were approved, they're just kind of, they're standing if they haven't had action taken on them.
Again, Jared, if there's a possibility for you to forward to us at a later date what those are from this committee, that would be helpful so that people can create new ones and not reinvent the wheel.
Yeah. It also would help, I think, for everyone on the committee to see the trajectory or changes in the way the commission has looked at or things that they have previously approved or places where we have previously gone. So that I think that would be really helpful to have that kind of list of previous recommendations.
Amy, I have a couple more process questions.
Sure.
Once we submit a recommendation, the commission gives it the thumbs up, the thumbs down. Do they submit any feedback to us as to why they voted it down potentially, so that we have an idea of like, oh, next year we should include a funding source or whatever it might be?
Yeah, both Jabari and I and Jared and Delegate Stein and Jennifer are all on those meetings. Oftentimes they will ask Jabari and I to, provide a little bit more context for a recommendation before they have their discussions and votes. They will, basically almost edit or, and then vote whether or not to accept the recommendation as edited, and they will ask us whether we're in support of the edits or not. And then we have brought that feedback back in the past. I think the last time we tried to suggest a curriculum, a climate related curriculum, through the Maryland legislature, we brought that, the feedback back that they were, that was not an appetizing topic that the legislature would be interested in taking up.
If I recall
I remember-
correctly, the votes in last year came down to they refused to have a dollar amount towards the public service ads. They took that out, and they didn't want mandatory climate education, only opportunities for those who chose to do climate education. And there were very strong feelings about that. And it was very clear that the motions would not pass unless we took out things that concerned a substantial number of the commissioners.
And I will also say that that topic of funding and the approach to funding has changed over the years. My first year in ECO, a bill or a recommendation was turned down because it didn't have funding in it with backup. And, a couple years later, now we're at the opposite end of that spectrum where funding should not be included. So. Does that help, Tristan? And do you have other questions?
Could you scroll to the bottom again? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
Could you scroll to the bottom of the screen just so that I can see the key actions?
Yeah, and you should have this in an email, Jessica. Jared sent it out to everybody. So in terms of this recommendation, is there additional information? Are there subject matter experts we should talk to? Is there anything that you would want to know in order to consider whether, and then vote on whether we're going to accept this recommendation and move it on? We have the time to do that before we have to submit recommendations later in the fall. So I just wanted to kind of get that out there. Tristan.
Okay, sorry. I realized I never put my hand on before. Okay, I'll do that now. So if one of the details that the commission is going to want to know is like who is in charge in carrying out these action items, I feel like that's information that I do not know and research that should be done. So, Jennifer, if you talk to somebody in the governor's office, like, do they have an idea of who might be the best person to be in charge of that? Or I don't really know who else to talk to, but somebody who has a better overview of how all of these different groups are managed.
It would be Megan Conklin in the governor's office.
But would she just oversee it, or would she do all the work? Because
she is already doing the work of working with each agency on their climate plans. And what essentially is asking them not to do their climate plans in isolation, but to actually bring in stakeholders and partners.
Okay.
And that the process of doing plans is already happening.
Okay.
And already funded.
Right. Okay. I mean, and I like that.
Would they go through a review process from Megan? Is it just like a recommended best practice that we're suggesting she include?
It's definitely a recommended best practice, and they have published last year's plans, and they're starting the new plans. And of course, the problem is that all of last year's plans were based on assumptions of Biden policies and Biden money that no longer exists. And so now it's going to be much harder to create plans. And that's why it's even more important for them to look outside for help, because achieving our climate goals with worse regulations and much less money is just really hard.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more that including the community in the process is, the best practice, should be standard. I'm just trying to figure out, if I'm Megan, how do I implement that?
So I have a question. Is it Megan, or is it I can't remember the name of the working group that the EO created, that Secretary McElwain leads? What is the name of that new working group that oversaw development of the climate plan?
Jared just put it in the chat,
Oh,
and
did he?
it
Okay,
is Megan who staffs it.
okay. And opening that up. That's it, the sub-cabinet on climate. So it makes me think that that's who we should be, that's who the recipient of this recommendation would be. The sub-cabinet on climate.
And so we're saying that the sub cabinet on climate, provides like a suggestion to the state agencies when they're creating their action plans to include these best practices, or is the cabinet reviewing the plan and saying, oh yeah, you guys look good. Oh, but you didn't do X, Y, and Z. We're not going to approve it.
Yeah, and I'm assuming we would want the sub-cabinet to recommend. I'm thinking of the verb here. Is it recommend? Is it suggest? Is it require? I don't know if they have the ability to require.
Does it feel weird that we're recommending that somebody else recommends?
That's kind of how we have to do it, I think.
Yeah.
But that's a good question. I actually kind of wonder about that myself, but I'm not sure if anybody here knows how that process works. Once it's recommended, once it's put out, how where does it go from there? I'm not sure. That's something I would like to know a little bit more about.
What I'd like to know a little bit more about the authority responsibility that the sub-cabinet has to the agency heads. Like, again, can they basically direct them to do this and say, in this year's climate action plan, you must, we're expecting you to work with stakeholders, or can they only just kind of make an ask? Tristan?
I was going to give myself the homework assignment of finding out who's in charge for Department of Natural Resources and creating our plan, and learning more about, like, you create this plan. How does it work with the subcommittee?
Okay.
I'll see what I can find out.
That would be amazing. Because then I think we could adjust Jennifer's recommendation a little bit to, again, spiral it in a little bit more, address it to the sub-cabinet on climate, make it so that it will work within the way the sub-cabinet functions with the department head, so that we're making it so that it's an easier vote yes, because this is the way it works.
Right.
I think that would be a great way to do it. It's nice. It doesn't need funding. It's already an existing program. It's a change to an existing program that I think is, I think it adds some work to the departments, but I also think it can benefit them by bringing in private, working and private funding. And so I think that's important.
Yeah, I agree. It handles the financial issues, and it also addresses a lot of climate injustice issues as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. All right. So we'll get a report back on you before our next meeting, and then we can adjust the language of this to go to cover whatever we've learned. And then, obviously we're going to go through our regular process of voting on recommendations and things like that. But at our next meeting, which is in August, which will be right before the recommendations are due, we will vote on this. That's one question that I had. I know we're coming up on time, which means we're not going to be able to talk about the education recommendation, but since we're running out of time and we need a little moment for public comment, is there any appetite by committee members to add a meeting in July? Because I feel like we have a lot of work to do on these recommendations. Yep, Laura's raised her hand. Is that a yes, Laura? Is that a?
It meant I was actually aiming for the thumbs up.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Delegate Stein put quite a bit in the, by the way, on this recommendation. They have to submit a report annually detailing their progress. Okay, that's great. Thank you, Delegate Stein. And then, all right, so appetite. So we had at least a couple of people raise their hands. Anyone else willing to come back together in July? Just a meeting focused on recommendations. We will go through the we have up to 4. By then we'll have Jared's list from a previous meeting, and it'll be a working meeting. So no presentations or anything like that.
Yeah. I say we go ahead and just schedule the meeting.
Okay.
Mhm.
Jared, are you good with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great
Okay.
idea.
All right. I think it's necessary, and I'd really like to, now that we have this new process, we can actually pull up the Google form we have to use. We can really dial in the language. And then once we have the language set, we can do the voting at the August meeting, which will be right before they're due.
Yes.
And that also will give us a chance to, so say we rework the climate education bill, it'll give us a chance to send it to Delegate Stein and make sure he's okay with it before we do it. It'll give us that month before we vote. Same with this one, we can send the recommendation, the edited recommendation back to Jennifer to see, if she has any input or thoughts on that before we vote. Again, trying to get these to the point where we're taking a few steps ahead of time to get them to a yes. And then, Jabari and I will have more backup and prep when we are sitting in a meeting and they are being debated heavily.
Yeah.
And sadly, ECO, well, I don't know if it'll happen this year, but ECO was the first ones that came up. So there was a lot of debate.
We spent a lot of time on that. Yes.
A lot. To the point where like individual words were discussed. And if that happens again, I'd rather just be in a really good position for some of that. So, okay.
And last year, I think I was hazed on that budget question, Amy. I did not know it was going to be that type of discussion, but hey, I'm prepared now, so we know.
Well, and I'm sure Secretary McElwain will have she'll have a plan for this year. Last year, kind of, like I said, it went a little.
Still working it out, yeah.
Especially with so many working groups. It was the first year with so many working groups, so it really did become a challenge to manage.
Right.
Okay, so that's going to be the plan. So I guess, Jared, before we move on, I want to open this up for public comment because I know our meeting ends in 2 minutes. So let's take a moment to welcome anyone. If anyone on the call is interested in public comment, please raise your hand or put a note in the chat. Okay, taking none. I think we can close out the meeting. Jared, I can't access the chats after the meeting. Will you please make a record of the chats that are in this one? Because there's a lot of really good information in the chats from this meeting. And we can share that out along with the previous recommendations to everyone to prep for the July meeting. And I want to thank Delegate Stein for joining us. I want to thank Jennifer for joining us. And thank Jennifer for this great recommendation. I think we have a good plan moving forward, and I hope hearing from our folks was helpful for you too as well.
Absolutely.
So.
And thank you, Dennis and Bryce also.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No, yeah, that's fine. I mean,
thank you.
They're still on.
Yeah.
Oh, they are still on. Okay.
Yeah. So this is the conversation we're going to continue to have. So it's going to be ongoing, and we'll make some progress. So we appreciate everybody.
All right. Thank you all.
All right. See you next month.
See you next month.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.